Okay, over to you.
Great. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for coming in the rain and outside of term. As Chris said, my name is Thandeka Cochrane, and I've been here for a month as the one of the Brian Weston Marconi Fellows. And what I've been doing during this time is I've been looking at a particular archival collection. This collection is part of the Oxford Development Records project. So from about the 1960s to the early 70s, there was something called the Oxford Colonial Records Project, which actively and consciously tried to collect memoirs and documents and information from colonial administrators across the British Empire. And then in 77, they started a project called the Oxford Development Records Project, in which they wanted to collect sort of memoirs and works from people doing development in areas that used to be part of the British Empire. And as part of this much larger project where they collected things on education, agriculture, the economy, all sorts of things, so all sorts of sections of society, there was a woman called Alison Smith who started this project. I'm not sure if it was her idea or if she just got put in charge of it. But essentially, she took on a project which wanted to look at medicine and public health in British Africa. And she was particularly interested in the period of transition from colonialism to independence. So she sort of framed her timescales as 1945 to 1965. You can see in the letters she sent to people that this sometimes got a bit annoying because people would say, oh, I got there in 66, so what I have to say is not interesting, or something like that. And she'd write back and say, no, actually it is interesting, even if you weren't there exactly at this time scale. She also gave people 6 months to respond, which at a time when everything was being done by letters was not so easy. So you can also see frustrations there, that they say, oh, I won't have time before the deadline, sorry. And then she writes back saying, no, please still send stuff, even if you send it in 6 months from now. So you can see her sort of navigating a lot the parameters she initially set for the project. She had an assistant called Mary Bill who also helped her, and they actually published one book together at the end of the project. So just a brief sort of overview. I was just discussing with Lucy what is so interesting about a collection like this is that this was a time when people were very consciously creating archival collections. So they were actually thinking, what do future historians want? What do we want to see and know in the future? And how do we make sure to save that material now before it's too late? And so, as I said, the whole project is much huger, but the way Alison Smith went about collecting these particular materials is that she first had a letter written with, of course, the Oxford logo nicely at the top. And it was signed by A. Duggan and A. Williams, who were sort of big figures in the field. So people would recognize the names and feel potentially more inclined to respond. And the letter just explains the project, which I just did. So it tells them what it's about and what they're looking for and what they want. And one of the things they set out quite clearly is this is not about official documentation. This is not about your published articles. This is very much an attempt to get your personal side of the story. And she reiterates this a lot in the letters she writes to people. Just tell me how it was for you. Like, how did it feel? What do you remember? So it's very much about memoirs, essentially. And in order to help people and spark their memories, she actually put together, or the team put together, an aid memoir that got sent out when people said they were interested in replying. And they have very many questions. So they have different questions for different people, like if you were a nurse, if you were a medical officer, if you were a missionary, you would have different questions. And then you would essentially go through the aid memoir and respond to it. But she again very clearly states, repeatedly, it's not an answer form. It's just something to spark your memory. It's just something to take you back to that time. It's just something to give you something to think about. What should I respond? So you can see that there was a lot of thought and effort being put into building the collection. It was very consciously done. So they obviously had to limit it a little bit because British Africa is huge. There were very many countries that were part of British Africa, so they chose Nigeria, Tanzania, and Uganda as the focus. Again, you can also see you get frustrated because people would say, oh, I was only in Uganda for 1 year and I was in Kenya for 6. And so she gets something about that 1 year in Uganda, nothing about Kenya. And then you can see that she's a bit like, you can also write about Kenya, it's fine. But yeah, so she sent that out. And then what is really interesting about the archive is she obviously got a lot back. So they're housed in the library in these boxes. And then in the boxes, they're housed in envelopes. And the envelopes will have the person's name on them and which country they were in and roughly where their government or mission. And then we have 44 boxes, so the Bodleian has 44 boxes with 165 responses, which is quite a lot. And from those, we have 77 women. So a very large number of women actually responded to this call. I personally think it's probably because it was about memories and about personal reflections and not your published works, your official documents. There's also at least 2 women sent back about 300-page manuscripts of books they wanted to publish but never did publish. So I think probably some of the remaining last few of those manuscripts are here. So these very long, beautiful sort of stories about their lives as either nurses or even some doctors or accompanying their husbands and then starting to do nursing or doing nursing and then marrying one of the doctors. A lot of this happened as well. One of the issues with a lot of the women that you see in the archives is everybody had to send a personal data form. This is a key part of the project. You would send back your personal data form, which explains just where you were and for how long. And you see with a lot of women, they'll write, 1946 to 52, I was a nursing tutor. 1952 to 54, I was a senior nursing tutor. 1954, I got married. And so then it also has this part at the bottom which says, what did you do after your time in Africa? And with a lot of women, it just says married or children or something like that. Part of the reason for that was that you actually were not allowed to hold a permanent position if you were married. So once you got married, you could still take temporary work within the colonial services or the nursing services, but you were not allowed to hold permanent positions. And this often meant that mission women, women working in mission hospitals actually could be married and work more because the missions weren't as strict, but the government was very strict. If you were married, you could not have a permanent post. So a lot of women just left when they got married. And a lot of women also married someone they met when they went to the country they were working in. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our boxes. Oh yes, this is interesting because it's Barbara Akim-Yemi, who is one of the few non-white people who was asked to respond to anything. There was also one Scottish-Nigerian mixed-race person who was asked to send things in. Alison does explain that they wish they could ask Africans because that would be ideal, but they're currently not at that stage of the project yet, so hopefully in the future they will. But they consciously didn't ask non-British people, essentially. Most of them are British. This person happens to be Polish. But essentially they wanted to know what was it like for British people working in medicine in Africa during this period of transition. And for that reason, we do have some very, very few African voices. So for example, in this collection, there are some letters written to the doctor saying things like, thank you for the money you gave me for supporting my family, or I'm feeling very ill and I have the sickness and I need money for medicine. So there's a few African voices there. And then one other collection, which is not shown here, his hospital had a weekly essay competition for the African medical orderlies where they would write something. A lot of it's about their own culture or cultural events that happened. It was in Lagos. cultural events that are happening in Lagos. And so we have a bit of a collection there of these African medical orderlies just describing their world and their lives, but that's about it. So it's a very British-oriented collection, unfortunately. But John Elifi has written an amazing book on East African doctors in the 1990s, which is like groundbreaking and all about African doctors. So there is a work out there on that, so that's good. Okay, so now now more into the detail. I just chose these collections because they show, or these boxes, because they show the diversity of materials that you can find. They're not necessarily the most interesting people in the collection. They just have very interesting bits and pieces that they've submitted. So this is a man called Nash, Dr. Nash. He was working in Nigeria. He was there quite early on. Basically being a medical officer, you can see he writes all over my tour, my 9th tour, my 10th tour. So they did what they called medical safaris, where they would travel around the country and visit all sorts of stations and try to understand the medical situation going on there. So he would, for example, he went to Anshu and he took some photographs. You can see that at the back here, they're marked. This one, for example, says the itinerant witch doctor for Anshu, which is not how you would name this person anymore, or the words you would use, but it shows that he's kind of trying to get a grasp of the worlds of people are dealing with in terms of the medical landscapes they're in. He also, for example, sent in all his invitation cards with the comment of, it's quite funny what he says, they are indicative of change in titles in the last years before independence. So he obviously felt that the changes in people's titles were maybe not what he would have liked, so he sent in these invitation cards to show how those changed. He sent in his medical history sheet, as Alex noted, a lot of malaria, so you can see what was your medical history sheet kind of looking like when you were going on tour or living and working in these countries. Very, very many people sent in photos of the Queen. There's a lot of people who the Queen obviously visited all of the countries. So a lot of people also met her. Some of them were even her doctors when she came along. So there's a lot of people sending in invitations, letters, photographs of the Queen. This is quite interesting. This is a map of Anshu, an area in Nigeria, and it says the Tsetse Free Corridor. So one of the things they did early on in the 20th century is they were very concerned with sleeping sickness. And so they actually just forcibly removed huge communities elsewhere because they decided that the area they were living in was too dangerous, had too many tsetse flies, and the only way to deal with that was to move them somewhere else. So they would create these corridors where there would be no possibility for the tsetse fly to spread the sleeping sickness. And there are also comments in the archives of how they would deforest huge areas to get rid of trees, because the more trees, the more tsetse flies, and how people would get quite upset, and then there's like petitions that they can actually move back to where they lived, and they're not being told they can't, and they're throwing DDT into the rivers, and so there's quite a lot of environmental and social destruction happening in the name of medicine. And then we also have, in a number of the archives, there are quite gruesome medical photos. So there's a number in here, there's a number in the rest of the archive that I won't show because they're very gruesome. There's just one leg, I can't remember quite what the disease was that the gentleman had, but it is interesting because you don't often see untreated diseases just out in the open. So you can see, for example, what cancer looks like when you don't have chemotherapy or surgery, and the extensions of the growth. So it's quite, a lot of it is very visceral. And then we're moving on to this gentleman, Dr. Natkansky, who was Polish. He went to Tanzania. Here you can see the personal data form filled out in not handwritten, so it's legible. With Natkansky, you can also see the type of memoirs they would write. So, he starts, I was born in Poland, I qualified in the medical faculty of the university. So this was kind of like what Alison really wanted, which was a little summary of your life. We also have some post-mortems that he did, and then he actually sent in his thesis as well, which has some really interesting photographs at the back of the people he met whilst doing his thesis, writing his thesis, which was on polio. And then the last box here is from a woman called Dr. Grace Lowe Jellicoe. She went to Sierra Leone and Nigeria very, very early on, in the 1920s, so she must have been quite a pioneer. As a doctor, she was trained as a full medical doctor, and she submitted a lot of stuff. So there's this whole box is her, and then another box is also her stuff. But she, for example, sent them all her letters. So these are her personal letters she wrote to her parents and her friends while she was in the field. And they're all here now. They're all in the collection. So she just sent her original letters, beautiful handwriting, as you can see. And she has the letters also from the Africans. And she has a bunch of photographs, and you can see the house they stayed in for a little while. This is a picture of her. This is a speech that someone gave on a hill, and everyone got a memorial card about it. So there's just a vast sort of mix match of things that you get. And sometimes you just get one personal data form and 2 letters, and that's it, actually quite often. But sometimes you get a huge bunch of stuff. So yeah, so that's the collection. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them about the collection in general or specific items on the table. And yeah, thank you to the Bodleian for letting me come and look at it. It's been really wonderful, and I've really enjoyed my time here, and please enjoy looking at it.
Thank you.